Okay, so I've been seeing a lot of people talk about this, and of course, doing what I like to do. I'm gonna go over Joe Rogan's video about the recent announcement from Spotify in regards to, um, well, his content. So let's go over this real quick.
Hello, friends. I wanted to make a video to address some of the controversy that's been going on over the past few days. And first of all, to say thank you to everyone that sent love and support. I truly, truly appreciate it. And it's been very nice to hear from you.
Okay, so this is really important because image is incredibly important when we're talking about these things. So he starts off by, and I'm not saying this is disingenuous, right? I want to be very careful to point out that I don't believe Joe Rogan does any of this intentionally, or at least not in a degree that he's aware of. Like I'm sure he understands that he needs to be positive and he needs to show gratitude to his audience, but it's not done consciously manipulative because there are some people that do this. But an important point is that by appearing grateful, your audience is much going to be much more receptive to your message, by virtue of how our group dynamics work.
I wanted to make this video, first of all, because I think there's a lot of people that have a distorted perception of what I do, maybe based on sound bites or based on headlines of articles that are disparaging.
Okay, this is also important. So what he's trying to do is equate the majority of the criticism that has been levied at him over these things, um, to a misunderstanding of what it is that he does with his podcast. Now, are there some people who have only seen clips and sound bites and don't actually and aren't familiar with the entirety of his content, the majority of his content, or his type of content? Yeah, sure, that's absolutely possible, but that's probably not a large percentage of his critics. Um, by virtue of the fact that his podcast reaches over 10, like there are 10 million subscribers, right? And that's not even the number of people who like watch who aren't subscribed, or who hate watch, or who watch, or sorry, who are aware of his content but don't regularly watch, so on and so forth. So this idea that, or what he's doing is he is, again through the use of his language, attributing uh, the this notion on anyone who views this, that anyone who, or the majority of critiques come from people who don't have a full understanding of either his content or what he's saying in the content that they are critiquing, which is not likely. Or I should rephrase that. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of people who have like left messages and stuff like that. Um, but like anyone who does this on a serious level, or who like makes money off of it, or who does what I'm doing where like they're making videos on it, is likely familiar with what Joe Rogan does, is likely familiar with the entirety of the content that they are critiquing.
The podcast has been accused of spreading dangerous misinformation, specifically about two episodes, a little bit about some other ones, but specifically about two. One with Dr. Peter McCullough and one with Dr. Robert Malone. Dr. Peter McCullough is a cardiologist, and he is the most published physician in his field in history. Dr. Robert Malone owns 9 patents on the creation of mRNA vaccine technology and is at least partially responsible for the creation of the technology that led to mRNA vaccines.
Okay, this is what's known. This is a quote unquote rhetorical trick. Um, or sorry, it's not a rhetorical trick. Because I don't want to call it a fallacy because it's not. But this is what's known as appealing to authority, right? So he's bringing up that these guys who spread quote unquote or that gave quote unquote misinformation on his shows are credentialed doctors, that these are experts in their fields, that these are knowledgeable men. And while that is true, this does not make what they say A, infallible, or B, not subject to their own personal biases, which is always the case, and C, doesn't make it true, right? So the major issue here is when we talk about when we talk about fields of study, we don't usually refer to a single individual, because again, an individual can have a flawed premise, is subject to personal bias, and the reality is that even if what they even when they present a theory and it is correct, it still requires other people to verify that said theory is correct. So the idea that you can attribute one thing in any field, especially today, to one individual, it's not really how it works. Additionally, the other problem with this is these are two men who have that he's had on his show, who are credentialed doctors, but neither one of them is an epidemiologist. Neither one of them's expertise as a doctor is in the relevant fields, right? So the doctor he references who helped create the mRNA technology did not create these specific vaccines, had no hand in creating these specific vaccines, and while he did come up with the technology that is, or come up with the basis of the technology that is used for the creation of mRNA vaccines, he didn't come up with the technology specifically for vaccines. It just has to do with mRNA and how it can be used in medical applications. The other guy is a cardiologist. Okay, that's great. COVID, or some of the side effects from getting COVID and or the vaccine, do have to do with the heart, which is cardiology, right? However, he is not a virologist and he is not an epidemiologist. There are reasons why we have these distinctions within the medical field. That's like saying that Joe Rogan is a sports commentator, and thereby anything he says about basketball should be taken with the same level of authority that he has on UFC fighting, right? Like these are not comparable things. Just because you work in the same field and you are an expert in a portion of your field, it does not mean that that knowledge is universally applicable.
Both these people are very highly credentialed, very intelligent, very accomplished people, and they have an opinion that's different from the mainstream narrative. I wanted to hear what their opinion is.
Okay, so here's the first problem with what he's saying here. They don't just have an opinion that's different from the mainstream narrative. They have opinions that are different from the consensus within the medical fields. Or sorry, the medical community. Communities? Actually, yeah, communities, multiple, right? So no, it's not that they have an opinion different from the mainstream narrative. It is that these are medical professionals whose opinion is in dissension from the consensus of the rest of the medical professionals. Or I shouldn't say the rest, because there are other medical professionals who hold the same opinion as them. But the consensus in the medical communities is not what these gentlemen are saying, right? And here's where this is misleading. You can have, and even if you do understand that point, you can have a dissension from consensus and it's like 30-70 or 60-40, right? That's not the case when it comes to COVID. It's almost hard not to call it just a unanimous agreement on the results, because while it isn't unanimous. It's like 99.97% of medical expertise is in consensus on this stuff. And turns out, just like with climate change science, the majority of people with dissenting opinions who are medical experts are in some way, shape, or form making money off of their quote-unquote dissenting opinion. So he has, from the start, mischaracterized every part of this. And again, I'm not saying he's doing this intentionally. One of the major things, or one of the reasons why it's been my personal pleasure to point this stuff out, is because this is innocuous stuff. This is stuff that if you don't know what to look for, if you don't know, and I'm not an expert in this in any way, shape, or form, but this is stuff that I catch and like to share. But if you're not aware of these things, it's very easy for them to slip by you and for you to be, man, always with the cars. It's very easy for these kinds of things to, I don't want to say lull you into a false sense of security because that's not what it is. But these are, the words being used are to manipulate your reception of them. And again, it's not necessarily a conscious thing, but you do have to be conscious of it to catch it.
I had them on, and because of that, those episodes in particular, those episodes were labeled as being dangerous. They had dangerous misinformation in them. The problem I have with the term misinformation, especially today, is that many of the things that we thought of as misinformation just a short while ago are now accepted as fact.
Okay, so here's where he's going to start steamrolling through some, or not steamrolling. He's going to go into a list of things, and every single one of these points that he's going to make here is just patently false. However, because of the way he phrases these things, without doing, because you don't need, if you've been following anything on this, you know that what he's saying is false. However, if you're only tangentially aware of these things, as most of society is, because most people have better things to do, not me, he's going to say some things that sound true, but if you're keeping up with any of this stuff, aren't. And it's easily just demonstrable that these are not true statements. So let's go over them one at a time.
Like, for instance, 8 months ago, if you said, if you get vaccinated, you can still catch COVID and you can still spread COVID, you would be removed from social media.
Okay, so first off, that's not true. Are there some people who were removed from social media who said these things? Yes. Is that specifically why they were removed, or why that content was removed? Well, no. So YouTube, along with most of the other social medias, have been very, very, while they are selective in who this stuff does and doesn't apply to, and that's to say, like, it's not like they're applying it fairly. Like, I will agree with anyone who's saying that, but it's not like you were outright removed from their platforms if you said what he just said, which was that if you get vaccinated, you can still get it and you can still spread it, because that's always been the case, even from the original vaccine. Now, have people been misstating that if you get vaccinated, you can't catch it and you can't spread it? Yes. And so while neither one of those statements is true, while that isn't true, that if you get the vaccine, and it's never been true that if you get the vaccine, you can't catch it and you can't spread it. However, when the vaccines first rolled out, and the only strain that we were dealing with was the original strain, which I think is called the alpha strain. I actually don't know what it's called. But when we were dealing with just that strain, the vaccines were so effective that the breakthrough cases were almost negligible. Now, again, they happened, but they were so statistically insignificant that there's almost no point in even citing them. That said, as the additional variants have come out, evolved. As the additional variants have evolved and started spreading, that original vaccine was obviously designed with the alpha variant in mind, not with these additional ones, which means and that's what the boosters are for. The boosters help reduce or increase the effectiveness of the vaccine, basically like updating your software for the new versions of the vaccine, or of the virus. But I'm getting sidetracked. So his point that you would get banned from social media for saying this factually true thing is not true. There are some people who did, but they said that in addition to other things, and those other things are why they got banned. Not because they said this true statement that we all agree is true now, that the scientists say is true, that may not have said that was true back then. But regardless, this is not factually accurate that you were banned for saying these specific things. It's that there are some people who said these things and other things and got banned, but they got banned for the other things, not these specific points.
They would ban you from certain platforms. Now, that's accepted as fact. If you said...
By the way, it's always been accepted as fact. There is Not even from the original rollouts of the original vaccines back in early 2021. What was it, like February or March? At no, I'm sorry, it was like March, April. At no point have they ever said, or has anyone ever gotten banned strictly for saying that you can still catch COVID and you can still spread COVID. Nor has nor has the science said that you can't catch it and you can't spread it if you get vaccinated. All they've ever said, or all scientists have ever said in that regard, is that it drastically reduces the chances of that happening.
I don't think cloth masks work. You would be banned from social media.
Again, not true. And even the scientists never said cloth masks keep you from getting it. They said it is a layer of mitigation that helps you from catching it and spreading it. And again, this is a great misunderstanding that I feel like a lot of people have with all of this stuff, that it's either 100% or 0%. And again, and I've covered this before, but for whatever reason, people actually, I think Destiny's, I watched something that Destiny was talking about recently, and he made an excellent point that I hadn't thought about. But he brought up that like people seem to only understand 3 percentages: 0%, 100%, and 50%. Anything else is very, very difficult for most people to not only imagine but to even apply. Which I agree with, right? So what he's talking about here is that like science would say that the masks are, let's say, like 90% effective. Well, that's close to 100. People would either say it's 100% effective. But then the minute somebody catches COVID, even though they had the masks, they would have said, oh, well, then it's 0% effective. When the reality is, well, no, that doesn't make it 0% effective, but it never was 100% effective. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Point is that this also is not true. No one's been banned for saying just this. So it's really important that we have to clarify that these specific points that he's bringing up are not why people were getting banned. Because people have been saying these specific things since the beginning and have remained on every platform. Because that's not what the misinformation is.
Now, that's openly and repeatedly stated on CNN. If you said...
Okay, and that is not true. It is not openly and often repeated that cloth masks don't protect you. It's that they are not the only, or they are not a foolproof deterrent. That they are one of multiple things that you should be doing. And while cloth masks do help, you should be using superior material, such as surgical masks, and if you have access to them, the N95 masks.
I think it's possible that COVID-19 came from a lab. You'd be banned from many social media platforms.
Okay, and this is not true. Because if you were banned from these things, then why are these still things that are being discussed on these platforms? Right? Because Joe himself has said that he thinks it came from a lab. Joe's not banned off of YouTube. So again, we have to be very, very careful with these things that we're talking about here, where this is a manipulation of the information that he's presenting. Because have people who said these things been banned? Yes. But is that why they were banned? No, they were banned because they said this, in addition to the other things, and the other things are what got them banned.
Now, that's on the cover of Newsweek. All of those theories that at one point in time were banned were openly discussed by those two men that I had on my podcast that have been accused of dangerous misinformation. I do not...
Okay, and so here's a really important point. Those two men that he had on his podcast discussed those specific things on his podcast. Joe, was your podcast banned? Then you're lying. Well, I should rephrase that. Then you're factually incorrect, which means that you're lying. Now, whether you're knowingly lying or you just haven't thought about this, doesn't really matter. Point is, this is not correct.
Not know if they're right. I don't know because I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a person who sits down and talks to people and has conversations with them. Do I get things wrong? Absolutely, I get things wrong, but I try to correct them. Whenever I get something wrong, I try to correct it because I'm interested in telling the truth. I'm interested in finding out what the truth is. And I'm interested in having interesting conversations with people that have differing opinions. I'm not interested in only talking to people that have one perspective. That's one of the reasons why I had Sanjay Gupta on, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who I respect very much, and I really enjoyed our conversation together.
Okay, except, what did you spend most of your time talking to Sanjay Gupta about, Joe? You spent most of that show yelling at Dr. Gupta about how CNN lied about your use of ivermectin and whether it's a horse dewormer. Did you talk to Sanjay Gupta about interesting things, or did you spend most of your time talking about what you were mad at in regards to an organization that he's connected to? So, like, that's also misleading. Oh, I had Sanjay Gupta on, who happens to be from this organization, who said bad things about me, and we had a fun and interesting conversation. Well, while that's technically true, what was most of that conversation about?
He has a different opinion than those men do. I had Dr. Michael Osterholm on at the very beginning of the pandemic. He is on President Biden's COVID-19 advisory board. I had Dr. Peter Hotez on, who is a vaccine expert. I'm interested in finding out what is correct, and I'm also find.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop him there because that's gonna bleed into another point. So he's using 3 examples compared to the other 2, saying, "Oh, look, I've presented both sides of this argument," which is true. He has. However, one of the major issues is that these are not equally prevalent. Sorry, these are not equally prevalent views within these communities that these men represent. Again, so if his point is like, oh, I'm fairly representing both sides of the argument. Well, no, because you had 2 men on who have a dissenting point or dissenting opinions, and then you had 3. He's actually had more than that. He's had like 5 doctors on who agree with or who support the points that the consensus of the scientific community has in regards to COVID. But it's not like that's not a fair representation of the community and the opinions within that community. So if he had these 2 men on who have dissenting opinions, even if we go with just rounded numbers, he would have had to have another 198 doctors on the side of agreeing with the, as he calls it, the mainstream narrative regarding COVID, to give a fair representation to both sides of this discussion. And then he's also going to make the point that I'm just searching for the truth, or I like asking questions or something to that effect, which I'll let him finish.
How people come to these conclusions and what the facts are.
Okay, except, and this is I'm going to finish up here because this is the last point I need to make about what he's saying here. If you watched the podcast episodes in which he had conversations with those gentlemen, right? So when he has the first 2 doctors that he brought up, when he has them on, it's just a conversation, and he asks them questions, but it's all clarifying questions. And he often chimes in with, like, agreements on what they're saying. Or like, oh, I didn't know that. That's so interesting. On the other hand, the doctors that he has on who have opinions that don't agree with his, he has a confrontational conversation with them. And I'm not saying he's angry. I'm not saying he's mean or he's vindictive or anything like that. These are conversations. But the direction these conversations take and the way with which he engages with these other doctors is very, very different. I can't remember the doctor's name, but it's not one of the ones he mentioned. But they were talking about myocarditis and how a lot of cases are springing up in young men who have gotten the vaccine. And the doctor basically schools them on this point that, yes, there are cases of myocarditis happening in young men who have gotten the vaccine, but there are more cases of young men who get the disease and aren't vaccinated, and they're much more likely to get myocarditis from catching COVID. So it's the different, and it's like you're 7 times more likely to get myocarditis if you fit within this age range. If you catch COVID versus if you get the vaccine. And he argues with the guy for like a solid 10 minutes. And he does this with all of the doctors that he has on his show who agree with the mainstream narrative. He has a confrontational discussion with them where he's arguing with them over the points. He doesn't agree or he doesn't believe what they're saying without Jamie. And even there are even times where Jamie looks stuff up and he's like, "Well, that's not what I've heard," and then dismisses it. So these are not comparable conversations, Joe. And again, I'm not saying that he can't have them on and that can't be the conversation that he's having. But you can't paint this picture because this picture is a lie. You're not having these guys on and having the same conversations with the same tones and the same inquisitive nature. The guys that agree with your opinion, you don't confront them on things. You don't have Jamie look up information because you believe everything they're saying, even the stuff that you didn't know beforehand. Whereas the other doctors, you argue with them on things that you don't believe that they're saying until it's proven that what they're saying is true, and then you still have the same opinion that you had before they came on your show. So this is not the same thing. These are not the same types of conversations. And this is why this is, I don't want to say disingenuous, but this is why this is problematic. And again, I'm not saying Joe does this intentionally and maliciously. Most people don't do this intentionally and maliciously. But this is one of the major problems with these, with the discussions that we have on these things nowadays, is not checking your bias at the door, not understanding where your bias comes from, not realizing that your presumptions on a topic are going to direct you towards certain information and away from other information. The confirmation bias is going to make you stop looking for information once you found the information that agrees with the view that you had coming into the research that you were doing. Which is a major reason why I hate the whole do your own research points. Like, you can't. Like, yes, and to be clear, I'm not saying don't look up information, but understand that you are not an expert, that you are likely going to need an expert's translation of the information. And even if you do, that's still one person within a large group. And there's a reason why the consensus is usually what the community at large talks about, and is the quote-unquote fact of the matter. Because a large group of experts have these discussions all the time, and the likelihood that one person is aware of their bias and is still correct is not as likely as 100 people who aren't aware of their bias, but have those other 99 people to check them on their biases. That opinion is more likely to be correct. But anyways, and then for the bonus portion. So I came across this, and this is... Yaron Brook is a libertarian, and I don't mean I mean like a libertarian, like government is bad, there should be no government kind of libertarian. And this just made me want to stream at him, and it was a good thing I was at work because I didn't. But this was important.
American ruggedness was not just what created America. America taking from other people created that. So how do you reconcile that? Wealth is not an issue of redistribution. Wealth is something to be created, at least under freedom. Now, pre-freedom,
okay, so he's going to literally equate freedom and capitalism. That prior to capitalism, there was no such thing as freedom. And I don't know if that's intentional or not, but regardless, that is what's being stated here. That there was no freedom in the world prior to capitalism, and then capitalism broke the shackles off of every individual in the world, and that's how we got what we got. So I'm going to let him finish what he's going to say here.
Capitalism, pre-industrial revolution, we had a zero-sum world. It was I don't know if you've ever seen these wonderful income and wealth graphs that go back 10,000 years, and they measure human wealth and human income 10,000 years to today. The graph is basically flat. It goes up a little bit, down a little bit, and then in 17-something, it goes like that. It goes suddenly through the roof. And in Asia, that doesn't happen. In Asia, it stays flat, and somewhere like 1970-something, it goes like that. And what happens is, when you institute freedom, when you institute capitalism, an ugly word that so many people fear, wealth suddenly explodes. Not because it's taken from somebody, but because it's created.
Okay, so I'm bringing up I don't know if this is definitely what he's talking about. But where's this chart? Oh, that's not it. Okay, I don't have the chart that he's talking about. But he's just factually inaccurate here, and I'll explain why. So he says that prior to freedom being introduced to the world, which came about through capitalism, which was literally coincided with the Industrial Revolution, none of which is accurate. Economically, the world was basically a zero-sum game. What's that? Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, explained that no, trade was not a zero-sum game. Which, by the way, we've been trading for how long throughout human history? So Adam Smith himself, who wrote Wealth of Nations, which is where most economists kind of reference most of their points from, is like, Adam Smith's understanding of economics. No, trade is not a zero-sum game. So the assumption is that if I'm raising chickens and you're raising cows, and I trade you my chickens for your cows, we both get what we want, but because we're trading literally chickens for cows, there's no gain, right? However, what this ignores is specialization. So if I have to farm, so I have to grow crops and I have to raise different kinds of animals, that takes a lot of different levels of knowledge. I have to do a lot of different tasks. And therefore, I can get all these things done. It's not like it's impossible. But what specialization allows you to do is it allows you to focus in on one specific thing. Now, farming is probably farming is a more difficult example to illustrate this point. But when you specialize in stuff, it allows you to focus in and, for the most part, produce more of that thing. So let's say, let's change this. Okay, or let's use a different example. So we're both blacksmiths, and we make all of the farming equipment for our villages, right? And our villages are close enough that that we can trade products. So our farmers trade goods. You and I trade goods as blacksmiths. Now, let's say that we realize, well, wait, why are we both making the same things when I can make horseshoes and you can make plows? And if I just make horseshoes, I can make I can still make enough to shoe all of the horses in my village, but I can also make enough to shoe all the horses in your village, right? Because I am now only making horseshoes and not plows too, I have more experience making horseshoes, so I'm more likely to find little things through the process that makes it easier for me to make those horseshoes. And the same thing with you and the plows, right? So not only am I able to find little ways to be more efficient, but the more you do something, the better you get at making it, or the better you get at doing it. So by virtue of the fact that I'm only making horseshoes, I'm going to end up making faster. I'm going to end up making horseshoes faster. They're also likely going to be better because I'm more familiar with what a good horseshoe, or like what makes a good horseshoe, what makes a bad horseshoe, so on and so forth, right? And then when we trade, because we've specialized, I'm able to make more horseshoes, you're able to make more plows, but we're still able to meet everyone's needs and then some. And I forget who there's an Arabic economist, they weren't really called economists back in those days, but this is like medieval age or Middle Ages time frame where he discovered this, and I forget his name. So they've known that trade, which you would think is a zero-sum game, has not been a zero-sum game, which means that trade allows you to, and that's without, and this is without specialization, but trade has always created additional quote-unquote wealth. And then trade also allows specialization, which also creates additional wealth. So his point that, the Industrial Revolution, you see this massive surge in wealth globally. Well, let's examine that for a minute. So what is it about the Industrial Revolution that could possibly have done that? Well, his explanation is, well, freedom. What's the what's the tie there, right? Like, there's no evidence that this is what happens. Even if we're granting that, he's not demonstrating this in any way. He just says it. Well, prior to the Industrial Revolution, this is how things worked. After the Industrial Revolution, this is how things worked. And then he's also equating because you see the growth in wealth after the Industrial Revolution, it had to be this thing that the Industrial Revolution allowed, which in his mind is freedom. That's the cause. And this is what's called correlation and not causation. So he sees the timeline, and after this point in time, he applies the increase in wealth, which does happen, to another thing that also happens on that timeline, which is the introduction of not free markets, but social mobility. That you're no longer stuck doing the thing that your father did. Freedom. However, what is it about freedom that would create wealth? Well, nothing. Inherently, right? There is nothing inherent about freedom that would generate wealth, especially on the levels that he's talking about. Because I don't have this graph, but the line goes like this, and then it just shoots up. So then what could have caused that? Well, let's examine that for a minute. So what is it about what did the Industrial Revolution cause? Well, primarily what it caused was specialization. But it also introduced manufacturing. And not like literal manufacturing, but an increase in productivities because of processes and, again, specialization. Okay? So we've already explained that trade is beneficial. Trade is not a zero-sum game. Trade creates wealth. So let's connect some dots here. If we understand that trade creates wealth and industrialization increases productivity, meaning you have more goods, what are you going to do with those goods? Well, specialization means that you don't make everything that you need, which means that you engage in trade. If I make more things, I engage in more trade. It's almost as if the Industrial Revolution didn't create wealth because of freedom, but it created wealth because there was an increase in productivity, a massive increase in productivity, and said productivity led to a massive increase in trade. Okay, so this, I'm going to go back. What Yaron Brook says here,
wealth is something to be created, at least under freedom. Now, pre-freedom, pre-capitalism, pre-industrial revolution, we had a zero-sum world. It was very, I don't know.
That is not true. Is it closer to zero-sum than it is to our current understanding of wealth generation? Yes. But it has not been zero-sum since the concept of barter was created. It has not been a zero-sum game. Additionally, I'm going to leave it there because
I don't know if you've ever seen these wonderful income and wealth graphs that go back 10,000 years. And they measure human wealth, the human income, 10,000 years as today. And the graph is basically flat. It goes up a little bit, down a little bit. And then in 17-something, it goes like that. It goes suddenly through the roof. And in Asia, that doesn't happen. In Asia, it stays flat. And somewhere around 1970-something, it goes like that. And what happens is when you institute freedom.
Okay, so here's what, again, his premise prior to even looking at the graph is that freedom creates wealth. That people being free to pursue whatever trades they like, to create whatever businesses they want. His premise, his presupposition is that freedom generates wealth. So then when he finds the graph that shows that there's very little wealth generation and all of a sudden it shoots up in the 1700s, his assumption is that has to be connected to freedom, because that's the information that he's looking for. This is a post hoc justification. Nothing about that graph says this is why, and then points to freedom. All it does is show the timeline through which wealth generation happens and the amount. He's the one that's connecting the time frame, 1700s, the Industrial Revolution, to the generation of wealth. However, was there an increase in freedom due to the Industrial Revolution? Well, no. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, most people were farmers. Farmers had to work a lot, but farmers work in what's called cyclical, or what is it? Cyclical something. Okay. We all understand that you don't farm all year round. You basically do no farming in winter. Now you take care of your animals, but you aren't taking care of crops, you aren't planting crops, you aren't harvesting crops, right? During the summer, they do a lot of things because that's when they have to plant everything. And then during the spring, they have to take care of those crops. And then during the fall, they have to harvest those crops. But that happens early in the fall. And then from that point on, there's no more crops to take care of until after winter. So while you may work a bunch during summer and spring, you don't work nearly as much during fall and winter. Okay? So you could spend 12 hours a day working during summer and spring, but maybe 4, if that, during winter and fall. Now, what did most people, and most people were farmers prior to the Industrial Revolution. What did most people do after in the Industrial Revolution and then after the Industrial Revolution? Most people were in manufacturing. Most people worked in factories. What were the hours like for a manufacturer How long were shifts during the Industrial Revolution? 12 to 16-hour shifts. So again, if you're a farmer, yeah, sure, you may work 12 hours a day for half the year, but then during your slow times of the year, you work a lot less. This is not freedom. If you spend your entire day, almost every waking hour, spent making products, is that freedom? To me, that's the opposite of freedom. Okay? And that isn't even considering what their wages were like. Which means what were their living conditions like? And we all know the stories about company towns, where the company owned everything in the town. So whatever wages they paid you, they were basically able to make sure that you never made enough to ever leave. You never made enough to not have to work 12 to 16-hour shifts. Oh, and by the way, this is prior to overtime laws. So this was all at those really low wages. I hate to break it to you, Yaron, but this is not freedom. This is what most people were doing in the Industrial Revolution. So again, what he needs to be doing is explaining what is it about the Industrial Revolution that created these conditions that he calls freedom, which then created the increase in wealth. And there isn't. What that graph points to is the increase in products made, which means that yes, there is an increase in global wealth, but what were those guys at the top called back in those? Oh, that's right, they were called robber barons. It was called the Gilded Age. This is not freedom, and even if this was, most people didn't see that wealth. So, no. You don't know what you're talking about. And anyone who listens to this guy and thinks that the woke student gets a free education on capitalism, you're all idiots. Anyway, that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching.